Welcome back to Smarter Markets at IETA's North America Climate Summit 2024. I'm here with Hugh McAlpine, partner at GS Environmental. Good to have you here, Hugh.
Thanks, David. It's great to be here.
Thanks. And I wanted to ask you, as we're having people in at IETA's conference, I was curious, what brought you to the conference this year?
Generally, I like the IETA event because it seems to bring a really broad range of decarbonization industry professionals. I think that, we spend a lot of time in VCM Paris circles, and often that can feel like a little bit of an echo chamber. So it's really nice to get alternative perspectives, people that run adjacent to carbon markets, because these are really tricky problems that we're trying to solve here, and the creativity that brings, I think, is really exciting. And as I was saying before, carbon markets can often really get you down, and I think that the energy that I can draw or that is generated at events like this is really encouraging, and I generally feel great sort of going into my day-to-day after post-event,
That's terrific. And besides the energy, is there something, are there certain issues or topics you're looking forward to having discussing this year?
Right. We are, GS Environmental is a proprietary trading firm. We spend a lot of time thinking about risk and how it can be distributed in different places for sort of different benefit. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about hedging strategies, products that might provide interesting ways to manage some of the risks associated with these markets. More specifically, I've been seeking out and having discussions around potentially different index type structures where we can distribute risks across a variety of markets or a variety of individual projects in a VCM context, and in that way more effectively manage our own risk, potentially attract new capital, and scale these markets in a way that is meaningful.
That's interesting. I know you trade across a number of different parts of the carbon markets at GS Environmental. You have different compliance markets in different regions, voluntary carbon markets. How much do you see trading across those or using one to hedge another market? Where do you see the opportunity and some of the challenges for carbon markets this year?
Absolutely. Our founding premise is that carbon markets over a long enough time scale will ultimately converge. In the shorter term, it's about getting the appropriate policy frameworks in place to create the momentum for that convergence. And so what we see sort of more immediately is compliance markets incorporating voluntary components, incorporating renewable energy type products. And so at this sort of crux, we see quite a lot of opportunity to generate returns, but also to provide liquidity. A lot of what we do as a market making firm is provide liquidity in places perhaps where liquidity doesn't exist, or it exists in a sort of patchy type fashion. And so using or sitting at that crux of sort of newer voluntary, often driven markets, or perhaps new compliance type environments is something that is really attractive to us with the intention or the hope that markets ultimately sort of converge to a significant extent. I don't think we'll have one sort of global carbon price, but ultimately it would be nice to have fewer rather than more.
And as a market maker, where do you see the opportunities and some of the challenges for the carbon market
this year? I think that all eyes are on how corporate emissions reporting guidelines are set up. I think that as those policy settings perhaps are built and ripple through markets, we find that particularly interesting. I think there's a little bit of a misnomer, certainly in voluntary markets, that new policy drives parabolic changes in activity, where in actual fact it happens slowly. Rome wasn't built in a day. It takes time and consistency with these products these policies to ripple through different markets. And it's about being there, I think, seeing those opportunities and ultimately responding to how people are interpreting that policy and whether or not we agree with it.
I know. Always in carbon markets, there's the concerns about quality and integrity. You're a market maker, having to think about pricing all different types of of carbon offsets and carbon credits. I was curious, how do you think about the quality spectrum?
It's a great question. I think that technology ultimately will help us to solve some of these issues, and I think that people are really important to this discussion as well. It's about looking at particular projects and the teams that are associated with them and how they understand the inherent risks associated with the product that they're looking to build. But ultimately, I think the policy settings just need to get to a point where it's good enough to create momentum and ultimately build from there. And I think as a firm, we're confident that takes place. I think more specifically, we use technology and ultimately the experience of our team and the experience of others to try and understand whether or not quality is priced appropriately. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, and what we've seen historically in carbon is that price is the best indicator of quality in some but not all contexts. And perhaps in projects in the voluntary context that have sold off really heavily, perhaps quality lies there too. And so it's about taking the time and try not to get absorbed in sort of a broader discussion or a broader negativity, and try to find what quality looks like, perhaps where others are not looking.
When you think about the balance of buyers and sellers, ultimate producers of carbon credits, project developers, and those who would use them as part of their climate action plans, how do you see the balance of that market between the supply and the demand side?
There is a sort of, by the data, it seems as though there is a significant oversupply in voluntary markets. And I'll speak in voluntary market context because it's a little easier to answer the question. At the same time, though, there is a profile or a bucket of credit types that corporates particularly like, and that's really where the liquidity is focused. There's a lot of noise as a result of that and sort of a long tail of credits. But what I'm encouraged by, and something that we spend a lot of time looking at, recognizing that policy drives these markets, but somewhere where I tend to focus time and energy is on a much shorter sort of retirements, transactional volume, week to week, month to month. And it seems to me that there is a consistent sort of foundation of transactional activity being translated into retirement activity over the last 1 to 2 to 3 months. And I think that's really encouraging. The names of the retiring firms are big names that you and I both know in the retirement sort of logs in the last week even. And so there are firms on the buy side that are getting on with it. There are firms on the sell side that are trying to create the best possible product for them. But I think the foundation is being built in a healthy way and in a quiet way, which I think is important to recognize. And I think that perhaps not enough time or energy is focused on that sort of what I call sort of bricks in the wall weeks, where it's a step-by-step process. It's tough to rebuild markets such as this, and I think that it's important to recognize that building is happening.
When you look at some of the bricks, are there certain methodologies or project types or types of offsets that are a little bit more in demand, that look like they'll be more foundational to that wall than others?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you look at recent transactional data and really where, if you were to look at our trade history, for example, in the voluntary space, we tend to go where the flow is. It's predominantly Red Plus type credits, despite the fact that Red Plus is being criticized so heavily. It's still something that's in demand. And the signals that you see from large corporates looking to sign offtakes with nature-based solutions providers, it still seems like stakeholders on that buy side are looking for nature-based solutions because of the range of co-benefits or positive externalities to those projects. So I think that despite the criticism, Red Plus is certainly an area of focus for a lot of buyers, or continues to be. And then I think sort of the reliable, measurable projects like gas-related projects or methane-related projects, these things that are highly measurable, they can be produced in significant quantity, which ultimately means that they have significant impact, assuming that the accounting is appropriate. And I think that we're starting to see, at least in the day-to-day market, a real focus on sort of alternative technology-based credits, I mean, as an alternative to renewable energy, and RED Plus as well remains certainly attractive to the end users.
I'd like to ask you one more question before I let you get back to the conference, and that's, is there any one development that you're going to be following most closely in the coming year?
I spend a lot of time looking at CORSIA. I think there'll be a lot of keen eyes on how ICAO and the TAB assess new, which I apologize if we're getting technical, assess new programs and whether or not they include new programs into that sort of broader ICAO set of approved registries or standards. And then things like biennial transparency reports, how countries are sort of interpreting Paris guidance, because ultimately we see CORSIA as a pioneer or a framework in a broader Article 6 type world. And it's largely a test of whether these programs can work. And I think that's particularly interesting to us and what we'll be spending a lot of time on top of keeping an eye on how these foundations are being built in a voluntary context. I think that's particularly interesting.
Well, thanks so much for stopping by, Hugh.
Thanks, David.